Hello everybody, this is Naz and welcome to Esports Economist. This is a topic that I've wanted to do a show on for a long time. I'd like to talk about coaching in esports and in Dota 2 in particular. It's something a lot of you know. My own career as a Dota 2 coach was short and rather undistinguished. Last place TI6, never forget. But this is something that's come up in conversation quite a lot recently, and it's something I think is important to understand if you're looking at where the scene is going and the evolution of esports as a whole. So, as many of you know, esports is very different from traditional sports, but I still think there's a lot to be learned by looking at how roles in traditional sports have developed over time. So NFL and Major League Baseball are grouped together because they're large team sports with actions divided into discrete plays. So there's very much a role for very hands-on coaching where coaches dictate the strategic composition of all plays as well as the tactical approaches that are going to be taken within all plays. You also have, because of this, very large coaching staff with a lot of individual responsibilities. You have offensive and defensive coordinators. You have individual position coaches. And the distribution of who's responsible for the team's overall strategy, the approach that they take across plays to win the game versus tactics, the execution in each individual play is divided among a lot of different people wearing a lot of different hats. It's important to note as we go through all of this that even within a particular pro sports league, the composition and the role of coaches differs actually a lot from team to team. So from the NFL, a lot of head coaches will call their own plays on offense, whereas a lot of the teams will use an offensive coordinator to do that. Coaches are involved in different aspects of the team's strategy and of the team's play in very different ways. And so that's something we're going to focus on when we talk about esports, because my own belief is that the role of a coach is going to be very different from team to team. Now, as a direct analogy, I think coaching in esports is actually a lot more similar to European football, soccer, or the NBA. These are sports where you have continuous actions, possibly interrupted by a period or halftime and timeouts, and where coaches control player substitution and direct the team only during breaks. So because play is more continuous, you don't have this guaranteed break between every play. Coaches will direct the action. They'll direct the team's tactical approach to varying degrees by signaling things in from the sidelines, but coaches overall have more responsibility for the team's strategy and organizing practice time. So I think this is a much more direct analogy to what you're going to see in esports. And then, of course, you have ATP in tennis, which is largely an individual or 1v1 sport at the highest level. And in this sport, it's very important. There's a very strong role that players not receive coaching of any kind during play. And this is going to become important when we talk about various esports placing different restrictions on whether or not the coach is allowed to communicate with the team at various points in the game. ATP is probably the strictest in terms of you are not allowed to signal with your coach from the stands at all. That's a very serious offense. Okay. So there are some, I want to share this stuff with you, even though a lot of you will not be interested. There are some economic studies, behavioral studies in general of coaches and managers, some on the psychology side as well. Just as a benchmark, there's a paper by Thomas and Van Horn that are finding that among Division I college football coaches, the average salary is actually $550,000 per year, more than $1.5 million total compensation. And we find that coaches' contracts and statistical behavior of salaries are actually quite similar to CEOs of major companies. So this has been used in a lot of the arguments whether or not the NCAA is really an amateur organization. That's beside the point. But coaches really are increasingly in sports franchises. Coaches are managers. They're filling a lot of the same role that CEOs do for companies. There's also some evidence on NFL contracts, again, similar to corporate execs, where you have incentives and excellent individual performances more likely to be promoted at another team or firm than inside. That has some implications for the industry dynamics. There's an interesting, very well-known older paper by Romer, a very big macroeconomist. This was kind of a one-off thing. But he described a phenomenon that I think may eventually be important in esports, and that's that coaches' risk aversion matters in NFL outcomes. Basically, the premise of the paper was that statistically, if you look at the league success rate on fourth down, that NFL coaches go for it on fourth down a lot less often than they should by some purely statistically optimal criterion. And the leading explanation for that is very simply there's an asymmetric loss function when you look at behavior, where if the team goes for it on fourth down and makes it, yes, the team does get credit, but the credit goes more toward the running back that made the play or the quarterback that made the throw. Whereas if the coach goes for it on fourth down and misses, the blame falls disproportionately on the coach. So coaches are rationally quite risk averse in their play calling, and I think that those kinds of dynamics you're going to see mattering more and more in esports going forward. An interesting aspect in professional sports that's also going to come up in esports is whether or not roster composition and in-game coaching are taken care of by the same entity or they're separated. Now, most sports, the coach and the general manager are two distinct roles, the general manager being responsible for personnel decisions, who's actually on the team's roster, the coach being responsible for what each of those players do, and obviously there's some interplay between the two roles. Currently in Dota 2, of course, roster decisions are coming almost entirely from the players themselves. There's very little scope currently in the Dota 2 scene, and I think this is a fine thing for where we are right now. Very little scope for any external entity deciding on who's actually going to be on a team's roster, but that is already happening in other esports. It's important to notice, and I do think you're going to see Dota 2 moving a little bit more in that direction over time. There is also probably my favorite paper, and this is of course by Dick Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize in economics this past year. There's a landmark paper by Massey and Thaler that found that in the NFL, high draft picks are systematically overvalued. There's actually a little bit of a loser's curse. And when you talk about things like teams tanking at the end of the season to try and get a higher draft pick, that basically teams are putting way too much value on these speculative, these great looking players. And I actually think that there's a lot of that in esports, that a lot of teams, if you point to personnel decisions over the last few years across all of esports, have been chasing that young superstar. There's almost overvalue put on the option value associated by a young player. Everybody wants to look like a stud and find the next Sumail. Comparatively few people are willing to stick with that veteran who's maybe been underperforming a little bit. And again, I think you can tell a number of rational behavioral stories for why that is in terms of who's getting credited for what, making the decision. It is worth mentioning as well that Toby Moskowitz in his recent scorecasting book found that the same logic applies for 6 fouls in the NBA, that people are that coaches tend to be a little bit too risk averse in terms of putting players with 5 fouls back into the game. And that's, again, I think the same logic is in the rumor paper, that if that guy fouls out, everybody says, well, what the hell is the coach doing? If he's in there with 5 fouls and makes a great play, the player is great, not the coach. Anyway, all right. So back to stuff that you guys will care about. All right, so if you look at coaches in esports, this is just intended as a quick survey. So CSGO, to me, is probably the most interesting here because we had this interesting kind of natural experiment where in August 2016, prior to that, most coaches actually used a coach as a 6th man or in-game, emphasis on in-game shot caller. This is, to me, the biggest example of really an esport that it was designed as a 5v5 game, but was actually at the highest level being played 6v6. The coaches, at least for many of the really good teams, were dedicated shot callers. They were constantly on comms, active, processing information, really doing some of the same things that a lot of players do in other esports. In August 2016, Valve issued a rule prohibiting coaches from talking during rounds. So all of a sudden, coaches couldn't be your shot caller anymore. And this really helped usher what Thorne and a lot of other people have referred to as the parity era, where after that you had 10 $250,000 plus tournaments won by different 5-man rosters, where before that, prior to this, Fnatic itself by itself had won 4 $200,000 plus events in 6 months. So this really changed the dynamic for a lot of these teams. It took away a lot of the advantage from the richer organizations that were able to provide a coach and provide more infrastructure for the teams, and really opened up the sport. Now, of course, we've gone a little bit more back to coaches having an active role, that coaches do get to talk during freeze time, they get to call timeouts, and in general, the analogy, as we've talked about in previous videos, between CSGO and Dota 2, yeah, it's a little bit tenuous. Remember, in Valve, the CSGO and Dota 2 teams, very discrete entities. It might as well be different developers for a lot of cases, but I do think that there's a lot to be learned from looking at CSGO evolving over time. League of Legends has pretty much from the get-go, the coach has been on stage talking to the team during draft, must leave the stage during the last 15 seconds. It's interesting to me that in the franchising model, which officially League of Legends has only adopted the franchising model fairly recently, but even before the current incarnation of NA and EU LCS, the league has been the closest in terms of an esport to the traditional commissioner's office structure of pro sports leagues, where Riot has been playing the commissioner's office for a long time. It's just kind of all been codified in the more recent franchising of the LCS berths. But I think that Riot has been acting this way for a long time, and as such, it's interesting to note that the head coaches in LoL have very much been written into the rules for a long time. The head coach, for example, is required to be present for games in business, casual, or better attire, and a lot of other conduct rules for coaches as well as players. Contracts and affiliations are restricted for coaches just like they are for players. Tampering with another team's coach is considered just as serious in many cases as player tampering. There is a minimum salary that's in fact the same as players. So again, we've talked in some of the previous videos about Dota being at one end of the spectrum where there's not much structure in the scene, LoL being at the other. You can see it for coaches as well. The role of a coach is very codified. There have even been some people that have suggested that a cultural inclination to listen to coaching or to be more receptive to coaching is actually a factor in the success that the Korean teams have had in League. I don't know how much I buy into this, but it's out there. It's been put forward by a couple of people who I do think aren't completely full of it, so maybe worth investigating. So now for Dota. So we have had a little bit of a change. Since early 2016, most teams competing at Majors TI have used coaches. I think for me, the turning point for this really was the Shanghai Major, where you had the two SEA teams both using coaches during that event, and they improved a lot in a very short period of time. When you looked at MVP Phoenix and Fnatic 2-3 weeks before that event, they really looked completely disorganized in their officials. Their drafts made no sense. All of a sudden at that event, they had the coaching. They drafted much better. Their execution was a lot more consistent. So ever since then, I think a couple of other turning points as well, but most top tier teams now do use a coach in some fashion. Now it's important, okay? Coaches are not allowed contact with the team at any point during the game. Exceptions are only made for extended timeouts. So if you have a situation like back in TI4, for varying reasons, the teams were leaving the booth for extended periods of time due to internet outages or player sickness. Oftentimes in those extended timeouts, coaches are allowed to come in, but otherwise, no contact with the coach. Now, the recent change has been starting with the Dota Pro circuit this season. Coaches are now on stage and may communicate with the team during drafts. And you see Heen up there for Liquid. You see Sunby up there for Secret. You see them fairly active during the drafting discussion. So I do think that that has made a bit of an impact already. But I think so far the impact of that rules change really hasn't been felt as much as I believe it will be by the time we get to the start of next season. Again, as is always going to be the case, but I think more for Dota 2 than other sports leagues and other esports, the role and expectations for a coach vary wildly by team. What the team needs, the coach is there to provide. I don't think there's any kind of uniform coaching model. And again, I think you go back to the traditional sports leagues, which do have a more stable infrastructure over time, and you see that even there, the responsibilities of the coaching staff and the delegation of duties within the coaching staff vary a lot by team. So I think you're always going to see that in Dota. There's no one answer to the question, what does a coach do? Again, this will come up later, but organizations in Dota play much less of a role, And most of the roster changes in Dota up until now, and probably for at least the next year or so, are still going to be driven by the player and the captain, the current players already on the team. So it's important when you talk about incentives and optimal coaching behavior that we're still at the point in Dota where functionally coaches serve at the behest of the captain and the players. We're still, if you're kicking somebody, the coach may be involved in that decision, but the decision to kick somebody, the decision to bring somebody onto a team is ultimately, in 98% of cases, going to be initiated by the players themselves. I actually do see that changing slowly over time, but that is where we are, and it's not going to change quickly. The biggest thing when you look at Counter-Strike, when you look at League and what coaches are able to do there, biggest thing to me is that coaching requires infrastructure to succeed. We're not always there yet in Dota. We've just gotten to the point in the last season or two that every event is pretty much expected to provide team practice rooms, to provide space at the venue for warm-ups, to provide amenities that are geared toward players playing their best game on stage. We are not always there for coaching infrastructure. We still don't have a sixth PC in the practice rooms at TI or at any events. We still, even last year, we actually had to fight to get coaches and two other people, coach and manager, paid their way toward TI. Valve was initially only going to pay for one person other than the 5. So infrastructure-wise, we do still have a way to go, and I think one of the biggest things over time is that coaches are going to have more of an impact in Dota as that coaching role becomes more integrated into events and the resources that they provide. It's not just about the coach is allowed to be on stage. It's we are expected to, we need to have robust internet connectivity for a tablet for the coach. We need to have the extra room in the practice area for the coach to be actively participating in the team scrims, etc. I do think those things are going to happen over time, but they are very important and behind the scenes. Overwatch, I'll comment briefly on. OWL is doing very well, of course, in the last couple of days, as I expected it would, because OWL has adopted the same franchising model or similar franchising model to League of Legends. Blizzard pretty obviously willing to step in and insisting on stepping in and acting as the commissioner's office. I think it's going to evolve similar to League. I think coaches are going to be very important, and I think you're going to see that infrastructure provided from the beginning, which is a very good thing. Now, I do think still in League and in Overwatch, there's a lot of room for differentiation and specialization in the roles of coaching staffs, having dedicated analysts, having these sort of coordinators that are responsible for working with individual position players and responsible for improving different aspects of the team's play. So I think there too, you're going to see a lot of evolution over time. All right. So let's talk about what coaches actually do. And so I think I'll touch on this throughout the other points, but let's get this right out of the way first. So I think there are two things that you need to understand. Number one is that, again, as I've already alluded to, the role of the coach is always going to be different by team. When you're coaching a team, it is always about them. It's never about you. I talk to a lot of people, for whatever reason, I've gotten approached by a number of people in the last few months saying, hey, I'm working with this team, or I'm thinking about coaching this team, or I have this opportunity. And the number one thing that I tell them is, if you expect to be successful as a coach, again, take my advice for what it's worth. Last place TI6, never forget. But to me, if you expect to be successful as a coach, it has to be about them and not about you. I see a lot of people who are looking at it as, oh, well, I've got this great laboratory to try out my ideas, and I think that's a huge mistake. Coaching, to me, the second point, all right, the most important thing that you do as a coach, all right, there's this old saying in competition that if you're not getting better, you're getting beat, okay? The team that finishes in 12th place, all right, 9th to 12th place at TI this year would probably beat and possibly even crush most of the top 4 teams right now, especially with the organizational structure that we have in the DPC. Teams are getting better. And so when I look at a team like Secret, when I looked at a team like Liquid last year, who I thought was going to win, it's not so much about where they are right now. It's, do they have that potential left for improvement between now and TI? With Liquid last year, I was convinced the answer was yes. With Secret this year, my answer is very probably, but I'm not quite as confident. That team, I got asked at the Captain's Draft event this last weekend, can you see a scenario where this Secret team finishes outside the top 8 at TI? And my answer is absolutely I can. That scenario is that they stop improving, because all of these teams that finish in the top 8 at TI are going to get dramatically better between now and August. And that's the thing that you need to be focusing on. You have to have, as a coach, you have to have a plan for a long-term team improvement that all 5 players are buying into. If you don't have that, you're wasting your time. If you don't have a plan as a team for how you're getting better on a game in, game out basis, I think you should do something else with your life, because you're not playing competitive Dota. Anyway, specific roles of coaches. Number 1, in-game strategy, play calling. In Dota, obviously, that's not that important, because coaches aren't going to be communicating with teams on stage while they're actually playing the game. There is no one best model for this. I do think one of the things that we'll touch on, I do think that because coaches are not allowed to be present for the draft, over time, the role of captain is going to evolve to put more emphasis on shot calling than drafting itself, because that is something that the coach can at least help with. I don't think many teams, I don't think the majority of teams will ever completely abdicate the responsibility for drafting to the coach, because I think overall, there has to be responsibility. There has to be the comfort level and the execution level with the 5 heroes among those 5 players that are actually going to be playing. But I do think over time, the shot calling role is going to become more important in captaincy than drafting, because the captain can always lean on the coach for help. Individual players in Dota, I really believe, just because of the nature of the game, it's more like basketball. It's free-flowing. You know, regardless even of whether coaches are allowed some limited form of in-game communication, which I don't really think they should be, individual players are always going to be responsible for tactics. So again, shot calling to me, that's a tactical thing. Even a limited understanding of some understanding, not even limited, of dynamic strategy, as in what objective do we need to be threatening right now? How can we generate the greatest advantage to end the game at such and such a time? That's always going to be on the shoulders of those 5 players. So again, the coaching solution, I've heard a couple people, when the initial change was made to allow coaches on stage, saying, oh, well, that's ultimately going to devalue some of these players like PPD or Theban or Puppey or whatever. I don't think that's true at all. There's always going to be dynamic strategic awareness that's necessary in the course of a game. Between game strategy, this is something where coaches are absolutely responsible, helping the team prepare for a specific opponent. So again, my own opinion is one of your most important roles as a coach is as a sieve. All right. We in Dota in particular, somewhat in esports in general, but definitely in our game, we're drowning information. We're very blessed. We have all these replays. We have a ton of helpful sites out there. Hopefully DatDota is among them. DotaBuff definitely is. We have a lot of information, but it's more information than the team can actually process. And so part of your job as a coach is distilling all that information and presenting it to the team. So, you know, I had a conversation with one of the players just as a spectator, because I knew the guy personally, at the Captain's Draft event, and said, "Oh, hey, you're going to be up against Y player mid tomorrow. You know, have you watched some of his replays? Because I think he's a really good player, but he's a guy that if he misses CS in the first couple of waves, he'll play really forward onto the ramp. You can tilt him a little bit. He's vulnerable to rotations coming from a particular side of the map." And this player was like, "Oh no, you know, I just hadn't had time to do that." Understandable. We're all coming off Christmas, but that's the kind of thing to me that a coach can put together. You can put together, you know, really, I would love as a coach to have like my own video editor. Okay. So put together clips for each position, especially for LAN matches of, okay, here's an example of a lane, a particular way that this player played a lane early on, missed a few CS. Here's how he positions himself to kind of press and try and catch up. And here's how he got caught with a gank coming from this particular side of the map at this timing. Not necessarily that we should run that exact play, because of course he's seen it already, but just giving that particularly mid-position player some insight into how the other team thinks, and giving the captain some insight into smoke timings, word placements. Those are all things, again, this is part of why I see the coaching role over time is going to be eventually split between multiple people. You'll have a coach and you'll have a couple of analysts / coordinators that are going to be responsible for documenting and putting together information on specific opponent trends. There's actually, to me, there's a lot of potential here for resources to get productively invested on that side. So the other responsibilities, a coach is a motivator. This is a really big thing. So right before I worked with Complexity, like I was committing the same error that I referred to a few minutes ago. I was like, oh man, I got all these sick strats. I got all these, sick things I think we can do in game. And as it happened, that was a team that had some success, but the personal relationships were a little bit frayed. And really, to me, in Dota, this is a maxim that a suboptimal play that all 5 people are on the same page about and buy into and execute to the best of their ability is almost always going to be better than the statistically optimal play where everybody's not on the same page. So the first and most important job to me is to get everybody to buy into the plays that you're running. And a lot of times, in fact, that's not about strategy. A lot of times that's about meeting with people both collectively and individually saying, hey, what are we doing in game? Do you agree with it? Why didn't you respond to that call of everybody go mid? And not the assigning of blame, but hey, let's all formulate this game plan that we buy into together. And then now that we've all bought into this game plan, we all need to be holding each other accountable. The other big thing, and I think this might, right now, in terms of the immediate potential for improvement in Dota, I think this is a really big deal. The organization of practice times in scrims. To my knowledge, most of the teams, I've worked with several other teams besides Complexity in less official capacity, and to my knowledge, for the vast majority of teams, 80% or more of practice time is still spent playing pubs. And so teams, we have come a long way. Most top teams do have some structured replay analysis where they sit down together and they watch game footage. Great. Most of it, I guess my complaint would be most of it is still they're watching themselves rather than in a scouting capacity preparing for opponents. That's a different thing. But we still, to me, in Dota, we're handicapped a bit there's really no current uniform vehicle for the improvement of specific skills or for practicing team plays in a specific environment. Can we, we're having problems. We're drafting a lot of early pushing lineups, and we're getting punished in our 25-minute base pushes. Can we practice those specifically? Can we practice specifically how we're responding to buybacks? For example, can we practice specifically how we're taking Roshan fights from a particular point on the map? All right. Those are all things that are systematic that you're going to see over and over again in scrims. And it's really difficult other than if you luck out. So by the way, I will say, and maybe Adam deserves credit for this. Maybe it's the org. I don't know. I will say good things about Fnatic and about the players on their roster in 2016 leading up to TI from now until the end of my life, because that team was the one team I knew I could count on every scrim, every game, no matter the hour. They were always on time. They were always prepared. They took every game seriously. And so just knowing that I had one practice opponent where if we drafted in a certain way and we said, okay, we're going to try and play this way and we're going to work on these specific things, we knew that they were going to take the game super seriously and that would be meaningful practice. Like, that's huge, okay? Because the approach that players and teams take to scrims is very varied. But still, I think there's potential for improvement. Custom game modes, to me, are a huge unexplored frontier, an opportunity for players to develop and practice individual skills. Again, having specific coaches on staff, some with strategic responsibility and some that are high-level players themselves and can actually do 1v1 drills. The concept of a scout team. This is something, I don't know how many of the Chinese orgs actually do this, but there's huge potential for me in an organization that has two teams, being able to have those teams scrim each other in a very structured way, and in particular, to have the coach of the A team, if you will, working with the more junior varsity team, looking at specific ways in which different future opponents run their stuff and saying, okay, every NFL team and every NBA team, when they're preparing, will say, okay, this week in practice, you're going to be Cam Newton. And we're going to try to give our defense a flavor of how he plays. This week in practice, you're going to be Steph Curry. All right. And there's a lot of value in that in terms of preparing the actual team. Not necessarily, you're never going to find a player, of course, with those talents, but just letting them know, letting them experience what they've seen on tape or on replays in this case in a controlled practice environment. I think there's huge potential for doing those things in Dota. And to my knowledge, nobody's really doing that. And again, just accountability, okay? That it's all based on trust. We have this goal that we've all bought into together, and the captain, personal dynamics in Dota are such. Dota is an incredibly stressful game, okay? I don't care if it's your twin brother. I don't care if it's somebody that, you know, you've loved since you were both kids. If you play Dota with somebody for a long enough time, you're eventually gonna have moments where you hate that person's guts and you don't want to see him again. All right, or at least that's what you think in the moment. The captain cannot always be the one holding everybody responsible. It just doesn't work. There's too much stress that builds up there, and a lot of times we just don't have a good release valve. The coach, there has to be somebody on the side that helps with that. And that's a lot of times I see, you know, a lot of people in certain situations in esports will question, well, is this guy qualified to be a coach? Well, how the hell do you know, right? Like, honestly, one of the most important functions of a coach is just being that pressure release valve and letting everybody on the team know that their voices are going to be heard by somebody. All right. And, you know, honestly, if you're qualified to do that, I think you can at least help a team in some regard. All right, so let me give you a specific, I've talked in general about some of these principles, but let me give you a more specific example. This is something that I did with Complexity, so again, take it with a grain of salt, but I introduced them to the concept of next play, and I think this is really powerful. This is something Duke basketball, Mike Krzyzewski has talked about for very, very years. For a lot of years. So let's suppose we're in a situation where a particular player makes a mistake that hurts the team. So in basketball, you get beat by your man or you're late on the help side rotation and the opponent scores an easy basket. In Dota 2, our Nature's Prophet built an Orchid in this game when you think the team needed a mech. In CSGO, a player peeked aggressively and got picked off when we already had a bomb plant, and so now we're at a disadvantage defending the site. Okay, there you go. So what are we going to do? All right. My one hard and fast rule, and this is something, I give the guys a lot of credit, this is something like I came in and I said, okay, you guys probably know more about a lot of Dota than I do, but if we're going to work together, I'm going to have really only one rule, and that's when we're talking on comms in a game, we are always talking about how we win the game from this point. We're never talking about you did this 5 minutes ago, blah, 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 it's your fault that we're behind. No. Or, hey, I was the one that made this play 2 minutes ago. I'm the reason we're ahead, or so you should listen to what I want to do. No, screw that. We are always talking about how do we win this game from the position that we're in, not about why or whose fault it is that we got here, okay? Next play. We are focusing on the next thing that we're going to do, how we're going to give our team the best chance to win from this position. So, for example, we're not talking about why Orchid is bad. All right, we're talking about, okay, we built Orchid rather than mechs to get value out of that item. We need to find pickoffs as a team. So how are we going to try and create those opportunities for the NP to TP in and get those pickoffs? We're not going to focus on one bad decision. Above all else, as I said on the last slide, this requires trust. Okay, it is very, very hard to let something like that go in the moment. Again, it's a stressful game. All right. Even at the highest levels, it's more stressful, if anything, than your pubs. And so it's very hard to let something go like that in Dota unless you have absolute trust that that is going to be followed up on. The next team meeting, an individual meeting, maybe after scrims, however you want, however works best for that particular 5 people, but that is going to be followed up on. So I don't need to fixate on that now in the game. All right, I'm going to work that out with my captain, with my off-lane player, with our coach, individually or collectively. That's going to be followed up on. And all of a sudden, once that level of trust is achieved, we can focus on, hey, how do we win the game now? Once you get to a certain level of play, I don't care how good a team you are, all right? I don't care if you're Liquid. Liquid won TI, again, lower bracket run, guys. Liquid won TI because they always gave themselves a chance to win. All right, they always, whether from ahead and behind, were doing what was going to give them the best chance to win the game. They didn't say, oh, you know what, F it, we screwed this game up, go next. They said, okay, we don't have a great shot from here, but we're going to make the other team earn it. That's the attitude, in my opinion, that you have to win TI. TI is the longest tournament of the year for a reason, okay? Just making that opponent earn every win is going to get you, I think, farther than a lot of other individual things. All right, now, here's the million-dollar question. I don't have one great answer to this. What makes a good coach? The best thing I can tell you, again, is that it's not about you, it's about them, okay? If you're looking at a coaching opportunity as, hey, I've got a chance to try out all these 6 strats that I have in mind, I don't think you're going to be successful. Like, I think maybe you can say that that's what Mad does for OG, but I don't even think that, knowing him. Like, I think he is a guy that is all about understanding the game and helping. Like, if you just talk to him, like, he's one of my favorite people to talk to because he loves the game and he wants to understand it better himself, and he wants you to understand it when you're talking to him. Like, it's something that I have an amazing respect for. And that, above all, that personality trait is, to me, what's probably made him more successful as a coach than any other individual characteristic. I mean, obviously, it helps that the guy is actually sick at the game. Like, look at the EU MMR leaderboards right now. But I think the personality is really is there. But let's talk about the different aspects in a little bit more detail. Good coaches commit to the teams. Basically, the most important way or effective way to care about somebody is that you give them your time. And so when I'm working with a team, like, you always come first as my player, okay? And this is where I think the coach and the manager role going forward need to remain very differentiated. I know that there's a lot of question from various teams, how much of that admin role is going to be on the shoulders of the coach rather than the manager. I think to be effective, the number one thing a coach needs to be able to do is, if a player comes to you and wants to talk about something or needs something, and you are involved in something that is not directly that with another player, you drop everything immediately and you talk to that person. Ultimately, that is your first and foremost responsibility, and if you're not actively signaling that on a daily basis, I don't think you're doing your job well. Great coaches inspire the trust of players, and the bolded part is the important part. Inspire the players' trust in each other. If you're going through a practice or going through a scrim, whatever, and your players are thinking to themselves, boy, I better work hard, I better take this seriously, or the coach is going to get mad at me, I think that's not going to be successful. The best coach teams are, boy, I better work really hard in this game, I better take this seriously, or I'm going to let my teammate down. It's I want to be responsible, I want to have my teammates back, not I don't want to get chewed out by the coach. And to me, all the great teams, yes, some of the great coaches famously go on these tirades, but I think what you see behind the scenes is that the primary role of the coach is to inspire the players' trust and really love in each other, okay? The coach is the facilitator, so the 3 I's, okay? Habitualize. Are we practicing all the things that we need to be successful at LANs? Not just in the game, but outside of the game. Are we eating well? Are we on a good schedule? Do we have a game day routine? Is everyone in the room setting an example that they want others to follow? So again, just a sort of random thing for me, but if I had an unlimited budget, all right, one of the things that I would do in a team house is have 10 PCs and not 5, okay? I think it's really difficult when the same room that you're playing scrims in is the room that all the players are sort of pubbing in, hanging out, chilling, relaxing, shooting the shit. Because look, there's going to be, the desks are going to be a mess. Shit's going to be everywhere. It happens, guys. Like, we all want to live a relaxed personal lifestyle. But I think the place where the players play casually and the place where the players play scrims, ideally those need to be better differentiated. And the practice room, the scrim room, needs to be a work room. That when we go into that room to play those games, that we are professionals, we're working, we're teammates, we're not, hey, I'm mad at you because this morning, you were making a lot of noise when I was trying to sleep, or, you said something about my girlfriend, whatever. No, no, no. We are colleagues. When we're professional colleagues, when we walk through that door, working together to achieve a common goal. All right. It's kind of the, James Leith, when we were working with complexity, called it the decision line. All right. The idea that you have the threshold of that room, that even if it's the same room, that prior to the scrims, everybody cleans up their area a bit. You all walk outside that same room and you come in together as a team. All right, I think that was very useful. I think it works even better when it's two completely separate spaces. Individualize. Again, it's all working with the individual players. You need to help them, not just help them understand what you're saying, but help them understand what teammates are trying to say. Everybody needs to feel like their voice is heard. Are there individual grievances? This is the thing. You always are going to have to be making the decision. Is this something best addressed in a team meeting? Is it something best addressed in a meeting with you, the captain, and one other player? That's on you as a coach, and there's a lot of motivation. I drastically underestimated. There's a lot of motivation and psychology involved, and prioritize. Okay, Dota above all else. All right, Dota is an incredibly complicated game. Like, people, when they talk about shit we say on panels, and okay, yeah, a lot of the stuff we say on panels, frankly, is for the sake of building a storyline. It's a little oversimplified. Fine, okay, but people still, when I see reactions on Reddit, whatnot, to what we say in panels, they're like, oh, well, that guy's wrong, or that guy's right, or oh my God, Cinder and God. All right, well, he kind of is, but shut up, don't tell him that. Point being, when you actually sit down afterwards and talk with the teams about what just happened, there's not this universal agreement. Like, when we sat down in Dream League after Blitz's like free storm game, one player was like, oh God, yeah, that was a totally free storm game. If they'd played that right and split pushed, he would have won easily. Another player that I talked to afterward was like, well, it was kind of, but there were a lot of options they had to shut him down. Like, you're not going to get universal agreement. And so the big thing is, when we're talking after a scrim, okay, it's very easy to fixate on like this guy's item build at level 1, or this other guy's what he did in taking a particular rune. Okay, you need to talk about the most important things first. And you need to, over time, have a consensus about what those individual things are going to be. What are we trying to do as a team? And you trust, again, this level of trust that the individual details are going to be filled in later. And finally, a coach is always going to be an educator. As a coach, great coaches are always first and foremost great teachers and great learners, okay? We are all learning about the game. We are all going to improve. We are not going to win any major LAN event by being as good as we are today. It is all about how do we get better. And as a teacher, this is something I can talk about from almost 20 years experience. The first thing you do is you need to establish credibility. You need to have a coherent narrative. Hey, why should you guys listen to me? You need to have that rapport. Those reasons can be different with each player, but all of those players do it. It's funny. A lot of people, I get this a lot with stats, right? A lot of people will talk about, well, oh, you know what? Pro players aren't going to care about this. Pro players aren't going to, yeah, that's bullshit, okay? Turns out pro Dota 2 players, on the whole, are insanely competitive. And all you have to do to get a pro Dota 2 player to care about really anything is to convince them that that thing will help them win. So don't talk to me about, oh, well, this particular stat, it's flawed statistically. No, if this piece of information can help that player win the game, he will care, okay? And that is the only reason. And that's just part of that establishing credibility. And of course, the balancing of positive and negative reinforcement and awareness of which issues are best addressed in which group setting or individually, as we talked about before. So long run changes. This is already going a little bit long, but I do think this is more specific to Dota 2, but also has some interactions with esports in general. There's a question of who does the coach ultimately work for. In Dota 2, it's currently the team, because in Dota 2, all of the roster changes, or at least the overwhelming majority, are dictated by the players as opposed to an organization. I do see this shifting a little bit over time. I don't necessarily think that Dota will, or even that it's good for Dota to go to some kind of franchise model, but I do think that there are a lot of benefits to having the orgs more actively involved, including better infrastructure, organization, and access to resources. I do think coaches will ultimately become more of an employee of the org as opposed to just the teams, but I really do think for Dota over time, it's always going to be a little bit of both. This is going to be a little controversial. I do think eventually coaches in Dota will have some say on the roster. I think you can look at what Kips is doing with Vega and maybe a little of what Jack's doing with VGJ Storm, and you can see there are some argument that having coaches at least have a lot of input, maybe not absolute decision power, but at least have a lot of input on how we're going to fill a particular opening in the team makes a lot of sense in terms of the plan for improvement going forward. And of course, the question that we touched on at least briefly, does coaching change the market for certain types of players? We have this very strong tradition in Dota that I would hate for us to lose, of the player captain. Ultimately, I don't think that that's certainly not going to die. I don't think coaches will ever replace the captain and drafter role. I do think, though, over time, there are lots of examples of one person on a team being responsible for the captaincy and drafting, but it actually being another person who's doing a lot of the shot calling in game. Different teams handle that very differently. I do think one of the things you'll see happen over time is that the captain's role will start to emphasize shot calling a little bit more, because you can always lean on that coach during the draft, although that'll take time. And this may change the market for certain players or archetypes, but I think the question of, because we have coaches now, are the market for players like PPD, Theban, Puppy, whatever, going to be gonna dry up? No, there's no way. I mean, those kinds of players are always going to be in demand because they help a team improve. And most importantly, there's never going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. There isn't in traditional sports, despite the impression. I don't think there's ever going to be in Dota. The coach's role is always going to be varied by team. And again, if you thought about coaching, if you have aspirations, the best thing I can tell you is you make it about them. It's about your players. It's never about you. As a coach, you are the sixth position support. Okay, you're the ultimate support player. It's not about your ideas. It's about how can you most help this team get better and learn to compete most effectively. All right. Hope you guys have enjoyed this. It's a topic that I care a great deal about, even if I may not end up doing it again. We will see. Thanks for listening. I will be back very soon with more of this and more Stats Don't Lie.